Hey, small business people and lovers of good stories in general. Welcome to episode 29 of Small Business War Stories. Today's episode was in Naperville, Illinois, right outside of Chicago. And I sat down, I had a pretty good long conversation with Mark Beyer, who is the founder of Victoria Amplifiers. Now, Victoria, within the guitar community, they're cult amplifiers. People love them. I first found out about them when I was playing down in Mississippi. And he basically took great care to recreate the same processes that were used to make amps in the 1950s and 1960s to make amazing boutique amplifiers today. And in the process, he created one of the biggest and most recognizable boutique names of amplifiers in the industry. And it was really cool to hear his stories. He talks about Bob Dylan and the kind of different stories with him and his son Jacob. And I won't steal his thunder because it's a pretty cool story. But this was part of the Soul of America tour, and the Soul of America tour is brought to you by Impact Crates. Impact Crates are aluminum dog safety crates. They're made in the USA. I used one for my dog Muddy Waggers every single day of the Soul of America tour. And if you go to their site to pick up which color you want and like what model you want, you can use code MUDDY20, MUDDY20, to get 20% off your Impact Crate. The episode is also brought to you by Badger Mapping. Badger is the #1 app for field salespeople in the Apple App Store, which means you can put in all the locations you need to visit, and it gives you the most optimal route, and it gets you there on time. And it's exactly what I used when I went from Austin all the way up to Michigan and back down for the Soul of America tour. It's what I used to get to where I need it. And if you tell them you found Badger Mapping on Small Business War Stories, they will give you 2 free months. And the Soul of America tour is also brought to you by Tecovas Boots, Tecovas. They're amazing boots, a company based out of Austin here. And I wore them every single day of the Soul of America tour, and it was awesome. I still wear them when I play out around town here in Austin. And the cool thing about them is that you get top-notch boots for a fraction of the price that you would get them at a retailer because they sell directly to you. Go check out their styles. They just came out with some more exotic styles. I have a pretty simple, plain roper style, but they also have some fancier things coming out in the pipeline. You can go to tecovasboots.com. That's Tecovas boots.com. And every episode of the Small Business War Stories podcast is brought to you by Proven. Proven is a leading small business hiring tool that I started with my business partner, Sean. And small business is the operative word. We love working with small businesses, people who maybe don't hire as often. We help you organize all of your hiring, and we design tools specifically for you and not for big companies with all the bells and whistles you don't need. So, you should join the thousands of small businesses that use Proven. Try it out at Proven, Proven.com, and there is a free trial. I don't want to wait any longer to get into the conversation with Mark. It was a great, great chat, and he told me all about the history of Victoria Amplifiers in this episode of Small Business War Stories in Naperville, Illinois. Small Business War Stories. Small businesses are the soul of America. And this is where they tell their stories. I am your host, Pablo Fuentes. And we are live here in Naperville, Illinois, and I am sitting here today with Mark Beyer of Victoria Amplifiers. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Well, you're very welcome. Thanks for coming out and doing the interview.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. And for me, it's a great personal honor to meet you because you and your company made the amp that I play on stage. And many of my friends in Austin and all over the country actually love your amps. So it's really an honor to be here.
Wow. Well, thanks. That's very kind of you to say that.
Of course. And today I want to talk a little bit about the world of boutique amplifiers, but I really want to hear your story about Victoria. So what do you do, and for the benefit of our audience, how did the business start? I know a little bit about the story, but I'd love to hear from you.
Wow. Well, it was really a thing where I wanted to buy a Victoria amplifier. I was a consumer for a guitar amplifier. This was back in the early 90s. And I guess the story is my entire life I've been a guitar player since I've been about 9 years old, but never really had the coin to buy new stuff. I'd always bought used gear. And my life progressed. I did a number of things. I never really played professionally, seriously. And I found myself as a stockbroker with enough money to buy a new amp.
Okay.
So I decided I guess I was probably around in my early 30s, that I was going to go buy my first brand new guitar and amp.
Okay.
And I went to Guitar Center, and I bought a brand new reissue Bassman amplifier and a brand new Stratocaster.
Okay.
Now, I happen to have a used Strat that I bought when I was in college, and a used Bassman that I bought when I was in college, but I wanted a new one.
Sure.
So I bought this stuff, brought it home, plugged it in, and I was shocked, I guess is the word.
Yeah.
Disappointed at how poorly I felt that the amplifier performed that I just bought. I compared it to my old original Bassman, and it didn't sound anything like it. It didn't have the same character. The dynamics were different. The quality of the sound, everything. And it was advertised as being an exact copy of an old Bassman.
Like a 59 reissue or something
Yeah,
like that?
this is when they first came out with them. And there was a review in Guitar Player magazine. They were very laudatory. And I thought, well, this is my ticket. I'll buy a brand new Bassman rather than this raggy old thing. Because the one I had was all beat up. I mean,
Well, that's kind of cool in its own right. But
yeah, well, back then it was just, when I bought it, it was just a used amp. I mean, there was no market for that stuff. It was literally the least expensive Fender amp in the store that was going to do what I wanted it to do.
Yeah.
I couldn't afford a super reverb. I probably would have bought a super reverb, but the Bassman was $250 or something. I bought it anyways.
Yeah.
So I took the back of the new amp off and compared it, because I wanted to see what was going on inside of it. And I compared it to the old one, and, well, the circuitry may have been the same technically,
Sure.
from a schematic standpoint.
Right.
It was very clear that the amp was built very differently.
Okay.
The new amp looked like a computer on the inside of it.
Right.
With ribbon cables, and everything was on a printed circuit board, and the resistors and the capacitors were these tiny little things, little chiclets that were on the printed circuit board. And when I compared it to my old one, which was for the most part original, it had all these wonderful, carbon resistors and these big yellow capacitors, and it just, not being schooled in electronics, I got the idea that, well, if I want an amp that's going to sound like an old one, I guess I'm going to have to build one.
Yeah.
So I basically put myself through electronics school circa 1960.
Wow. But this was in 1990.
Yeah, this is in the early 90s. I was still a stockbroker doing that full time. I had no intention or any proclivity to being an amplifier builder. I had no idea.
So it was almost like taking a class from 30 years before.
Well, what I did is I went to the public library.
Okay.
Because I knew I needed to know about electronics. I had no electronics background whatsoever. So in order for me to do this safely, I wanted at least to get some understanding about what was going on. And because I was dealing with a vacuum tube product, what I did was I checked out basic electronics instruction books that were published prior to 1960.
Wow.
I didn't want to know anything about transistors. I didn't want it muddying things up. I felt like you got to walk before you run, So I was going to learn the basics of electronics as it related to vacuum tubes in the 1950s, and that would allow me, in my mind, to understand what was going on with these Fender amps. Mm-hmm. So I did that. I checked out these books, and I had learned about the basics of electronics, blah, blah, blah. And because I had more money than common sense, I was able to do things like have the chassis fabricated.
Okay, what does that mean for our audience's benefit?
Well, these days, anybody who wants to go build a guitar amplifier, there's a number of different distributors with catalogs that offer everything you need, from the raw chassis to the components, the transformers, the pilot light assemblies. I mean, everything is available out of a catalog now.
Okay.
You really, literally just have to go get a Mojo catalog, and you can become an amp company.
Got it.
But back then, that wasn't the way it was. And I had a friend who was in the sheet metal business. I had him make the chassis. I found another guy to chrome plate them. I found another guy to do the screen printing on them. And for literally every component in the amplifier, I was successful in having these parts made. I mean, I even found the manufacturer who made the wire for the original amplifiers.
Wow.
And they had a minimum order of 5,000 feet of wire.
That's a lot of wires. Lengths of wire using an amp.
Right. Well, you only need about 10 feet of wire at the end of the day in this thing. But
Yeah.
I wanted the right wire.
Yeah.
And it became clear that I was going to have to order it from these guys. So I did. I ordered a spool of wire.
Do you still have it like around here?
Oh, no, it's all used
Yeah,
up.
it's all used up.
I've been through a few thousand feet since then.
Yeah.
Had the wire made. I had a very interesting encounter. One of the big components in an amp like this is the transformers.
Okay.
They're very critical to getting the sound right. And I was lamenting the fact I'd made calls to Fender, who of course were zero help to me.
Yeah, I was gonna say they probably don't love this, right?
No, and yeah, I was just a nuisance to whatever secretary I was talking to at Fender.
Sure.
And I found the original manufacturer of the transformers, and I called them up, and they had changed hands a couple times by this time, and they didn't have any information on because I had the Fender part number from 1959, and I was laying these part numbers on these guys. They had no idea what I was talking about, and Fender didn't have any idea what I was talking about. So I was lamenting this to a friend of mine at a guitar show, and this guy I was talking to was the parts guy. You know, if you needed a bridge saddle for 1966 Mustang, this is the guy that's got the parts. So I'm talking to Tom, and I tell him my sad story that I can't find any of the specs in the transformers. He goes, "Well, you know, Mark, there's a guy down in Arizona named Tom that every time I have a question about transformers, I call Tom, and he's generally got the answer." So he laid the number on me, and I called Tom up, and I told him my story.
Yeah.
And Tom goes, "Well, you know, Mark, the reason no one's got that information is that when I retired from Triad," I guess he worked for Triad, "when I retired from Triad, I cleaned out my file cabinets and took all that stuff with me." I'm like, "What?"
So you're the guy that has the information.
And I said, "So you've got I've got all the engineering specs you need to make those transformers brand new." And he was kind enough to make photocopies of every one of them and send me every transformer that Triad made for Fender in the 1950s. He had all the engineering specs. And I'm not talking just superfluous stuff. He had all the super techie, the type of wire, the type of varnish to use, the type of paper to use for the interleaving, the exact specs for the steel, everything.
Jesus.
So I literally took these, at that time, they were 40-some-year-old engineering drawings, engineering data, and I took them to my transformer manufacturer here in Chicagoland and said, "Make this." And he said, "Yes, sir, this is what we'll do." And every transformer we've used since day one has been based upon those drawings.
And they're still made here in Chicago?
They're still made in Chicagoland up at Lenco in McHenry.
Amazing.
They do a great job, and it's like literally going back in a time machine and buying a brand new, transformer from the 50s.
So basically the time machine concept is interesting because basically the amp you're selling is like going in a time machine to buy a brand new
That's the way I like people to think about it, because you really are. I mean, every detail of the amp, because I didn't know anything about electronics. Yeah. I didn't know any better that a carbon film resistor is the same as a carbon composition, is the same as a metal film. Had I gone and gotten an electronics engineering degree, I would have been taught that the type of resistor doesn't make any difference.
Okay.
That it's the resistance that makes the difference and the
Right.
wattage, but the type, like the carbon. In fact, the old school resistors are actually kind of poo-pooed on because they tend to be noisy and the resistance value tends to drift over time.
Right.
So the real propeller head scope jockey type guys, they don't want that stuff. But I didn't know any better.
Right.
So I mean, I literally had to have the resistors made by the original company, the Allen Bradley company.
Yeah.
This is maybe kind of peripheral to what we're talking about,
No,
but I contacted Rockwell International, who owned Allen Bradley at that time.
Okay.
And I got a tip from a parts distributor that they were going to discontinue production of these resistors after they do one last run.
Jesus. That's not
So
something you
I
want
was
to hear.
able to ride their one last run, but I had to buy a couple $100,000 worth of resistors,
Jesus.
and we're still using to this day.
I
That
was
was a
gonna say, still
lot
have
of that was a
those.
lot of resistors, folks, and I still have a lot of them left. So
Okay.
every Victoria amp that's made is still utilizing these Allen Bradley
What happens
carbon resistors.
when those run out?
Well, I've developed a lot of good contacts in the surplus end of the electronics industry, and I have faith that there's enough stock of those out there where it's
Okay.
not going to be the end of the road.
Okay.
When I finally run out of 100K resistors. But
Gotcha.
that's going to be years down the line. We still have quite a few of them left.
Got it. Very cool. Very cool. So basically, your amp is like a time machine amp that allows you to buy what you would have bought back then instead of something that is sort of like the big corporate version of what Fender back then was a very different operation than it is today.
Well, yeah, the construction methods were different.
Yeah.
And maybe it's kismet that the way they constructed those amps, while I'm not going to say it's the most important aspect of the performance of the amp, it did have an effect on the dynamics and the sound of the amplifier, the actual construction. I mean, if you put something on a printed circuit board, you can't really use these type of components that I'm talking about, because nowadays it's all about putting them in the machine that inserts all the components.
Right.
And the concern at that point is, will it fit in the auto insertion machine, not how does it sound.
What is the most important, aspect or component to an amplifier sound? Like, what makes an amp sound the way it does?
Okay, well, I guess the smart-assed answer is the guy playing the guitar.
Sure.
Because
The tones in the fingers, right?
I can make any amps sound pretty good because I'm a fairly decent player.
Okay.
But if you're asking me, is there one component that stands out as having more influence than the others?
Sure.
Wow, that's a toughie, and I'm going to say it's everything summed together. I mean, to what extent is the sound colored by the wire that's used?
Yeah.
For instance, we'll take the wire as an example. The wire in the old amplifiers was a solid conductor wire. It was a 22 gauge solid conductor
Kind
wire.
of like what you find in your home.
Well, kind of,
Yeah.
but 22 gauges could not
Sure.
house wire, like 10
Yeah.
gauge or whatever. But the point is,
The construction of it is instead
modern
of being strands.
modern wire is stranded.
Right.
There's 20 different tiny little strands that
Yep.
make up the wire, and that's so you could use a stripping tool to strip the insulation off, and if you nick one of them and they break off, it's not the end of the world.
Right.
But if you had solid conductor wire with a PVC jacket that you had to strip, if you nicked that wire, it would be prone to breaking right there.
Yeah,
So
makes
this
sense.
old wire is actually called, it's a special kind of wire called pushback wire.
Right.
And it has a cotton jacket on it that's treated with wax, and it's it's not just like the stuff your socks are made out of, but it's designed so you cut the lead to the exact length you need, and then you push the braid back and expose the lead, so there's no having to strip it. Well, in the mid-1960s, that stuff was not UL approved. UL dropped their approval of pushback wire because it could light on fire.
Oh.
And modern types of wire then had to be used in the amplifiers, and they were stranded wire. The point of the whole story is that in the audio realm,
Yeah.
the audio signal travels through different parts of the wire depending upon the frequency.
Oh, okay. I did not know.
So low frequencies travel through the interior of a wire. This is why bass speaker wire has to be so big and stout, because those bass frequencies, for the most part, go through the interior of the wire.
Got it.
And as you increase the frequency, it has a tendency to travel more and more on the exterior of the wire.
Okay.
So high frequencies will travel on the outside of the wire.
Yeah.
Stranded wire, because there's more leads, per wire, has greater surface area. So there's less impeding the high frequencies on modern wire. So modern wire will sound brighter and treblier than vintage wire.
Interesting.
So if there's maybe one component, I would say the wire itself is something you really never think about, but because of this thing called the skin effect and where the frequencies exist
Sure.
in their electrons exist through the wire, that had a big effect. And one of the reasons I had to have the wire made is that nobody was making that kind of wiring. I mean, it was the company still had the ability to make it, but they didn't make it.
Right.
You
Because
know,
it wasn't UL listed.
yeah, because nobody was demanding it, but they were actually kind of surprised when I wanted a bundle of that wire. It's like, well, yeah, we can make the wire, but
Yeah,
you know,
but why?
right, exactly.
So how do you judge and test the sound of an amplifier? How do you know when something sounds just right?
I just know. I play through every amp that we build. The girls over in the assembly area, Joanne and Maureen, they do all the chassis assembly where they wire the components in the chassis. Then I get the chassis and I fit it in the cabinet for final assembly, and I put the tubes in it and make sure everything's working. Then I play through it.
You're the chef that tastes the soup.
Right.
Yeah.
You got to believe it. Yeah. So, you know, I've over the years I've developed a pretty strong library of amp testing licks.
I bet.
You know, so I can't stand to hear my own licks.
What's your favorite amp testing lick, or one that you wrote?
The theme from Beavis and Butthead actually is one of my favorite.
Or you played through a Strat or something into it?
Well, I primarily use Fender guitars to test, Strats and Tellys, because they're very revealing and there's not a lot to hide behind.
Okay.
So when I'm testing an amp, I don't want the guitar to color things too much. I want to be able to hear the amp. So because for the most part these circuits were designed to look at a Fender guitar, that's what I use to test the amps mostly. But you know, I'll plug a Les Paul or two in as well. But yeah, for the most part, I'll play a Strat, and I don't play the Beavis and Butthead lick every day because I get sick of my own stuff. So you got to kind of mix them up. Lately, I've been doing a lot of surf band songs. So so we're doing a Hawaii 5-0, a Good, Bad, and the Ugly. I know the girls are probably tired of hearing the theme from the Good and the Bad and the Ugly.
That's cool. But, the Ennio Morricone, like the actual like whistling part.
Well, I play the whistling part on the guitar.
Got it. That's cool. That's cool. That's actually my ringtone, which I don't know if I should admit to publicly or not, but it is.
Really? Far out, man. Yeah. That's a cool song, by the way. That song's got a lot of neat parts to it.
That guy was like a crazy Italian composer of movies, and he did The Mission, and then Quentin Tarantino got him to do the soundtrack for the movie Hateful Eight that just came out.
I'll have to listen to that.
Yeah, and it was the first time he got him to do that in a long time. It's actually, he's like a wild Western. He did a lot of those Westerns.
Well, I'm glad to hear he's still alive, because those were old songs.
Yep, sure are.
Yeah.
So what's your process to design and build amplifiers? Do you make mostly designs that were made originally by other companies, or do you make your own? How does that work?
The company started, I did nothing more than copy vintage Fender Tweed amps.
Yep.
So
basements and champs.
When I first started doing this, I really realized I would be able to sell more than one or two, because I was successful in building my first few amps. I took them to a guitar show and was very surprised that somebody bought them. I was able to sell them at the guitar show, which was, I brought them there to show people, to be all proud of them and everything, but people actually wanted to buy them, so I sold them.
Yeah.
This is right when the vintage market was catching up with Tweed Fender amps.
Yeah.
And it was more expensive to buy an old one than it was for me to build one and sell one. So there was a demand for the product, and the price was right. So I initially did nothing but build. If Fender built it in the 1950s, we had the ability to recreate it. So we did all that stuff. Well, those Tweed amps from the 1950s are great amps, but they don't have reverb, and a lot of players want reverb.
Right.
So in an effort to keep things moving and keep new product coming, we developed the Victoria Lux and the Victoriette, which are basically blackface inspired amplifiers.
And those came later in the 60s, right?
Well, those amps were designed by Fender in the 1960s, but Victoria as a company came out with those. Those were our first proprietary designs.
Okay.
The Victoria Lux and the Victoriette, and then we came out with the Regal and the Sovereign, and there's a few others. But as far as what's the design process, it really is based upon if I see a demand for something, and I think something would add to the product line, I'll go ahead and design it.
Cool.
I guess.
That's interesting. And you touched upon something that I wanted to ask you about, which is you talked about people buying old amps, vintage amps. So we've talked about three types of amps so far. We've talked about Guitar Center, printed circuit amps that are made by big companies.
Right.
Boutique kind of hand-wired amps, which is what you do, and a number of other companies do. And then there's also old amps, right? The amps that were made maybe anywhere from 30, 40, 50 years ago.
Right.
What's the landscape in the amplifier market? How do you see what's the difference for people, and how has that changed over time in terms of the market?
Well, it's super competitive as far as the boutique market.
Yeah.
And it's super competitive as far as the mass production market goes as well. The music business is a big business, billions of dollars trading hands, and there's a lot of people that want to be part of the pie. As far as the vintage market goes, the stuff that is worth the top dollar is the stuff that started the whole thing. The Fender Tweed amps, anything made by Fender in the 1950s or 1960s is going to command top dollar, and there's only so much of that stuff out there.
Right.
So the price is just going up and up and up and up. What I've seen is amps that no one would really consider to be cool amps all of a sudden becoming cool amps.
Like what?
You got those Sears Silvertone amps,
Oh,
and
that's
old Supro amps, and old lap steel amps, and old Gibson amps. Oddly enough, Gibson, their amplifiers were very rarely as cool as their guitars were. And there's some reasons for that may be beyond the scope of this, but Gibson amps, anything now, pretty much anything that's old and vintage, it doesn't really matter if it's actually cool or not.
Yeah.
They're starting to escalate in price.
Yeah, those Silvertone. I was talking to our mutual friend Nick in Austin, and those Silvertones, they sell right away. They used to be catalog and Sears amps, and now in vintage guitar stores, you get people who say oh, that's a crunchy sound. That sounds like a garage band from the '60s. Let's do it.
And they have that vibe. I think from a pure sonic performance point of view, those Silvertone amps are great. Unfortunately, the Silvertone amps were not built anywhere near as good as the Fender stuff was.
Right.
So they had a tendency to, they're less reliable. They have a tendency to need repairs, or they're broken, or they're going to be broken. And so.
Have you thought about making Silvertones like the way that Silvertone used to make them, but with your level of quality?
We actually did that with a couple Gibson amp designs. I haven't gone after the Silvertone market. I'm not convinced that there's enough demand for that kind of stuff to warrant doing that kind of boutique treatment on it. It really boils down to if the vintage piece is worth more than it costs me to sell it, well, then it makes economic sense for me to go after it. But if the choice is between a Victoria that's going to cost $2,500 and the exact same amp, a copy of the exact same amp that you might be able to buy at $800 at a guitar show, most people are going to spend the $8 rather than the $25.
That makes sense.
But
the Silvertones are going up in price, right? Because now they're like $800, $1,000.
Right.
Like the prime example is like $1,200. So maybe 5 years from now it'll be worth it.
Hey, listen, it's certainly possible.
Yeah.
And the design, the actual electronic design on those is competent enough that they're probably worth doing something too. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if there's guys out there that are maybe just copying the schematic and putting it in a different looking box.
That's cool. I want to be your first email when you start doing that.
Okay, far out.
Cool. What are some of the oddest, wackiest things that you've seen in your line of work? I'm sure working in the music industry, working with guitars, amplifiers, all kinds of personalities. What are some things that come to mind?
Reds in Clarksdale comes to mind.
Red, we were talking about it earlier. Tell me your best Red story.
I don't know. I mean, this is a family show.
No, this is you can cuss.
Reds After Hours,
man,
is one crazy place. Well, the one night that I was there was a couple big black women.
Yeah.
I want to say big. They probably weighed 300 or 400 pounds.
Yep.
And they were like having an out-of-body experience at Reds, where they were possessed by something. These girls were. And that was...
And Reds is a really interesting place because it's a legendary juke joint in Clarksdale.
Right.
And for anybody who hasn't been there, it's basically like an old living room with like a bar, and it kind of smells a little bit like a combination of beer and vomit, sort of.
Yeah.
And the music's top notch, but it's got a real special vibe to it.
And you'd never know it was there driving by in the daytime.
Yeah.
It looks like a dilapidated building that if somebody's abandoned, it's really a place. But hanging out down there and meeting all those crazy cats in Clarksdale, that was a pretty crazy experience. As far as other crazy things that have happened, well, I can think of a couple crazy customers.
Okay, tell me about those.
One of the nuttiest was Joe Walsh, the famous guitar player for the Eagles, Joe Walsh. We sold him a couple amps, and he absolutely loved the amps, but he wanted me to make the middle control so that when he set the middle control halfway up, it sounded like it was all the way up.
What?
This thing was, he loved the amp. I'm talking to him on the phone. He goes, Mark, I love this amp, but I have to turn the middle control all the way up to get the sound I want. I'm thinking, okay,
do that.
What's the problem there? You just turn the middle control up, and he goes, no, I only want to turn it halfway up and get that sound. And I had to scratch my head a little bit, and after I got off the phone with him, I called his tech up, his guitar tech. I'm like, what the hell does he want me to do here? He goes, no, he's exactly what he wants. He doesn't like turning anything on his amp all the way up. He wants there to be some room after all the way up in case he needs it. So we had to redesign the circuit a little bit so that Joe could get the rotation on the control that he was looking for.
That is just amazing.
God, another weird one was I was fortunate enough to sell amplifiers to Bob Dylan.
Okay.
And we sold Bob a bunch of gear. I've probably sold him 4 Golden Melodies, a couple Bassemans.
Wow.
And I never met him. And
I just saw him at Red Rocks, actually, about 6 months ago.
Yeah, I bet that was, it's amazing he's still out doing it at the level that he is.
Yeah. But sorry, continue with your...
Right, so we build these amps for Bob, and he loves them. And I get a call, I don't know, this is maybe a couple of years after that, I get a call from his son, Jacob.
Okay.
His people call me.
Okay.
And Jacob is interested in a Victoria amp.
Okay.
And I'm like, well, that's really cool. I sold his father these amps. He probably would like this amp that I sold his father. He goes, you sold Bob some amps? And I go, yeah. And the guy goes, well, you got to be sure not to say anything to Jacob about that.
Wow.
Because if Jacob knows that his father bought these, he probably won't want them. And I'm like, okay, that's interesting. And he ended up buying the exact same model that his dad loved.
You just didn't tell him about it.
No, the only person on planet Earth that I'm not allowed to tell Bob that Bob Dylan owns one of my amps is Bob Dylan's son. And if he listens to the podcast, he's going to find out.
Wow.
But,
Jacob, if you're listening, we're sorry that we broke this to you. They're still amazing amps.
Right. But I guess the story I got is that they valued their personal relationship so much and wanted to keep it so private that any kind of information I would have about both of them, it made him uncomfortable. Wow. See, they're so private and so protective of their personal life that this potentially interfered with that. So
that is wild. So it's not because they had a bad relationship. It's just had to
no. They have an absolutely excellent relationship. It's just one that they don't want the public to be privy to.
Got it.
So the fact that I knew both of these things, kind of put this poor tour manager guy was kind of like, you better not say anything about that.
Small business war stories, breaking news about the Dylans and their amps. Awesome. Can you think of a time when maybe you've been in business for how long now?
She's going on 1994, going on 23 years.
See, that's awesome. So in those 23 years, I've only been running my company for about 7 or 8 years, but there's been plenty of times when things go sideways and things go wrong. Can you think of a time when things didn't go well?
Oh, are you kidding me?
And
Absolutely.
then how did you handle that?
Well, two things happened. 2008 with the whole banking meltdown.
Right.
Had a big effect on Victoria. At that time, we had a contract with Fender, and we were making a couple hundred, maybe 300 or 400. I have to look at the numbers. We were making a lot of amps annually for Fender that they were marketing and selling under their Gretsch brand.
Oh, interesting. You were basically white labeling their amps?
We were.
The other way. They were white labeling your amps.
I don't know what white label means.
Okay.
But we designed, manufactured, and distributed from this facility the amps that were made between 2003 and 2008 that were branded Gretsch.
So those are desirable amps. Most people don't know.
Oh yeah, they're Victoria amps with a Gretsch name on them.
Wow.
And
so those are probably underpriced then relative to what they are.
If you could find them, they're pretty scarce in the secondary market.
Got it. Okay.
But we built a number of those, and it was a really nice thing for Victoria. It was steady money.
Yeah.
And it was quite an honor, obviously, to be able to do that. Well, when 2008 came around, Fender stopped all that kind of stuff, and that was all over like that, and that was kind of a shock. But the thing that was probably the biggest setback that we've encountered being in business is getting sued.
Okay.
And I got sued under the Lanham Act by a competitor who maintained that I had stolen one of his trademarked images.
What?
That logo behind you.
The one that I saw at the Shack Up Inn.
The one that's at the Shack Up Inn.
Yeah.
That lightning bolt was allegedly an infringement of a trademark of another company. And this mofo sued me in a federal court under the Lanham Act. And the Lanham Act is a federal statute which is meant to prevent people from fraudulently representing their products. So if you came out with a guitar and called it Fendler instead of Fender, well, then that would be subject to Lanham Act because it's purposefully confusing the consumer. You know, well, this was not that at all. This guy was just doing that to harass me, and I got served a federal lawsuit. It was a big, thick thing delivered by a DuPage County sheriff, and it was serious as a crutch. It cost me a lot of money to defend the lawsuit, which we eventually won. But I bought a few BMWs for attorneys that year, and it really ate into our operating capital. So to this day, I'm still kind of clawing my way back from the double whammy of 2008 and the concurrent to that, getting sued.
It happened at the same time.
Yeah, they all bang all at the same time.
That is crazy.
Well, see, the lawsuit came first in early 2008.
Yeah.
And then Fender canceled all their purchase orders. And mind you, Fender had an outstanding purchase order with me for a couple hundred amplifiers. And I got a letter from them saying, if you can't deliver these amplifiers to our warehouse in 2 weeks, then we're going to cancel the PO. Well, they weren't going to be delivered because it takes longer than 2 weeks.
They're partially built.
Yeah, I was left with partially built chassis. I could show you all the inventory that I bought. I mean, the whole Fender deal was kind of screwy. I ended up buying a lot of the parts myself.
Yeah. Can you then make them into Victorias and sell them? Or?
Through the years I've kind of done. In fact, there's one of the chassis there.
Oh, wow! Sitting right here next to us.
Yeah.
It does. Wow.
Gretsch chassis.
Oh, I see what you mean. It would be hard. It's got a lot of Gretsch.
Yeah, it's got all their stuff on there, and the chassis is punched for the parts and the way we constructed them. So I'm sitting on hundreds of those chassis.
Man. This is cool. You can make some art out of these.
Maybe. I don't know what I'm going to end up doing with them.
That's wild. Okay.
So like, yeah.
How did you handle? So in my experience, one of the hardest parts about being a small business owner is the psychology of it. So how did you handle your own psychology, and like how difficult it must have been to be dealing with both the cancel PO and the lawsuit at the same time? I mean, sleeping must have been tough. How did you handle keeping yourself together?
I don't know. Liquor and drugs.
I love the honesty.
It was, I don't know. It's just knowing that I was in the right. As far as the lawsuit goes, it infuriated me.
Yeah.
Because I was very. To make a long story short, I had a world-class branding artist by the name of John Casato. He's a brilliant graphic guy. He's a brilliant artist. He designed the logo, and I was very proud of it. And it was at a NAMM show that I had banners with the logo on it behind my booth, and I was very proud of it. It's a very visually striking logo. If anybody listening has a chance to go look at our Victoria Crown logo, I think you'll agree with me.
Yeah.
Well, the guy who sued me came up to my booth and started screaming at me, "You've got to take that down. That's my trademark. You can't use that lightning bolt. I have a trademark on that. You have to take that down right now." And I'm like, first I thought he was joking, man. And then it became clear he was serious when he physically got into my booth and started yanking on the banner.
Jesus
and it's
Christ.
like
the NAMM show is a trade show for the people who don't know. It's a National Association of Music Manufacturers.
This is in Los Angeles in early 2008.
That is wild.
And so, we almost came to blows right there.
Over the banner.
And he came back to my booth after, he left. He came back a half an hour later with copies of all these trademarks that he's pointing at them, and he's like, "Oh, see, this is my lightning bolt, and you've copied my lightning bolt, and blah, 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 blah."
Yeah,
and
lightning bolts for an electric amplifier. I mean, that's...
imagine that,
Yeah.
God, I don't want to go there because there's hundreds and hundreds of examples of lightning bolts and electron bolts being used to represent electronics.
That makes sense.
Since electronics, I'm certain Marconi had a lightning bolt on his logo. But at any rate, famous last words.
Yeah.
I looked him in the eye and I said, "So sue me."
Oh no.
And then, a month later, I got the lawsuit.
Served by the
and I mean, we could spend the rest of this interview talking about that whole process because it turned out that it was a personal thing. Through no fault of my own, this guy ended up hating me personally because of little things that happened and how our paths crossed.
Because of the show?
Just because of a number of things.
Yeah.
A number of little things. Our paths crossed through no fault of mine or no awareness of mine.
Yeah.
But from his point of view, this guy at Victoria Amplifier's got to go. He hated my guts. So when he saw that lightning bolt, I was just a straw that broke
So
the
knowing
camel's
what you
back.
do today and having, being more experienced as a business person and looking back on that, is there anything you would have done differently that you think could have made that situation better before it got to the point where two folks in uniform show up with a phone book worth of a lawsuit?
Boy, looking back on it, it's hard to imagine how it would have played out any differently.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I would have agreed to change the lightning bolt and some, because what we eventually, to get the thing to stop,
Yeah.
I'd motored through probably 125K on lawyers.
Jesus.
And ran out of money and ended up getting pro bono representation with the same law firm through a legal foundation in Chicago. And so my law firm agreed to work for free. That's how strong my case was. These guys knew and they were pissed off at what this dude was doing. But I didn't want these lawyers working for free.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact that I'm getting free representation doesn't mean they don't have to work,
Right.
I'm just not paying them, and I felt bad about that. So I agreed to change the look of the lightning bolt in question.
Okay.
Very subtly, from a 3-segment lightning bolt to a 4-segment lightning bolt.
Okay. That's 25% or a third, 33% more lightning bolt.
Right. So a number of things happened in the legal realm that made it obvious to everybody involved that I was going to prevail in this lawsuit.
Sure.
But I agreed to change the look of the lightning bolt. And when we presented that to them, they took it like that, and that was the end of the lawsuit.
Okay.
So maybe I would have agreed just to change the look, rather than standing on principle, and he's
Right.
not going to, he can't do this to me because you can't do this with lightning bolts. I
Yeah.
mean, maybe I would have forgotten about the principle of things and
Yeah.
just been a little more pragmatic. But in the grand scheme of things, it's hard to imagine it playing out any differently because what I said, this particular fellow who shall remain nameless.
Yeah.
Just had it in for me, and he was going to find one way or another to put the screws to me.
Cool. Well, let's go to a little bit more of an optimistic take.
Yes,
Where do you
thank
see? Where do you see? I want to see you smile again. Where do you see your business going in the next 10 years? What do you have this amazing shop here in the outskirts of Chicago.
Wow.
What do you and you have a mint brand name in the music industry, but at the same time there's this tension between like being able to crank out and work on every amplifier and test every amplifier yourself, and if you were to make 5 times as many, that would be harder.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good question. The question is, do I want to remain kind of at this small scale and build things one at a time? And in a good year, I think we would ship in this economy, I'd be happy to ship between 350 and 400 amplifiers.
Yeah.
Now, if I was shipping 2,000 amplifiers, obviously I'd make more money. How do I see it in 10 years? I see developing new products. It's very important to me to develop new products to keep things in the pipeline. My biggest competition are amps that I sold 15 years ago. I built them so well they work perfectly fine. So there's a lot of them used available.
Yeah.
And truthfully, that is literally my biggest competition.
Yeah.
So it's important to me to innovate what we have and to come out with some new products. And to that end, we're going to come out with some small head units. We never really focused on head style amplifiers, which need a separate speaker enclosure.
Right.
We've strictly, for the most part, done combo amps that have the speaker and the amplifier all in one box.
Makes sense.
We're going to experiment with some small head designs that we could keep the price point low. If I've learned anything in the last 8 years where the economy's been kind of lean, it's that pricing is everything right now.
Okay.
Prior to 2008, people didn't think twice about dropping a lot of money on a guitar amp, but the consumer out there nowadays is a little more careful about where they spend their money. I mean, every dollar is sacred these days. So my focus is going to be on developing new, smaller, more cost-efficient amplifiers to market to our customers. Awesome. So I see being in the business in 10 years, but our primary business, which has been these tweed Fender style amps, that's probably gonna ebb in favor of the new stuff.
Got it. Very cool. You still make them, just make fewer of them to make.
Yeah, or I've thought about going the Howard Dumble route and charging $20,000 for an amplifier.
Yeah.
And just being
and
total.
He has a wait list of like 10 years.
So. Yeah, a long wait list, and he's a total recluse and UPS.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll have a little break here.
Cool. Very cool. So I want to know from you, what would you say is the number one lesson or piece of advice that you've learned over the years that you would want to share with small business people or people who are interested in maybe starting their business? What's been kind of that nugget?
Wow, that's a big question right there.
That's what we aim to do at Small Business War Stories.
Watch your money.
Okay.
You know, there's a great wisdom. I think it's King David wore a ring that had profound wisdom written on the inside of the ring, and that profound wisdom was, "This too shall pass."
Right.
So when you're having boom times and you're selling a bunch of stuff, whatever it is, whether it's swimming pools or it's a landscaping business, whatever, you're going to have down times and up times, and it's not always going to be boom times. It's not always going to be lean times, but It's like, prepare to not, if some of the advice would be, if you're super successful, don't forget that it could turn on a dime. Yeah. So watch your money. Don't be cavalier with spending.
So build in margins of safety too, and put away stuff for a rainy day as well.
Well, yeah, that goes without saying, put away for a rainy day, but just don't depend on everything to be, the days of wine and roses, because things do change in business, and they could change through no fault of yours.
Right. Like the economic crisis. That makes sense.
Yeah.
What's it like to do business in the Chicago area? What's been your experience here working with the business community, with the government?
It's been a blessing. It's a huge metro area. Obviously, there's a lot of musicians and a lot of talent. A lot of places that my product can find. It's the right use.
Right.
Professionals using it.
Yeah.
I often think about that. If I'd have been born in Kansas City.
Yeah.
Would I have been able to penetrate the market the way I have and be as effective and be as well known? And I think the answer is no.
Really?
When I first started out, I've always been primarily a blues guy, and the amount of access to world-class blues musicians and venues, this is probably the best town on earth for that kind of thing. So I was able to meet and do business with Buddy Guy. Like the very first year I was in business, I was selling Buddy Guy amplifiers, Otis Rush, the late Luther Allison. We did business with the House of Blues when the House of Blues opened in the mid 90s here in Chicago.
Yeah.
So having access to all this vibrant economic activity, I think being in Chicago was a blessing. It was a very positive thing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. But you do a good job, because I first found out about your amplifiers. We were talking about this before in Clarksdale, Mississippi.
Yeah.
And on the stage there at the Shack Up Inn, where they have your amps there. So you do a good job.
Again, that's the blues community.
Yeah.
Really, probably the most important person. I would really would be remiss not mentioning Bob Margolin. Bob Margolin played guitar for Muddy Waters for years, and I got to know him over the years. And when I built my very first amps, I got in contact with him. He wrote an article. He wrote a column every month for a blues magazine called Blues Review Quarterly. And I called up Bob and asked him if he'd be interested in listening to my amp and maybe mentioning it in the magazine.
Yeah.
And he was very receptive to that. I sent him an amplifier, and he gave Victoria Amplifier our first and probably one of our best reviews I ever could have gotten. And this is back before the internet, so people actually read magazines, and it really meant something to, in print, have Bob Margolin write these lovely things about me and the Victoria Amplifier that we had sent him. So right out of the gate, the blues community was very anxious and very ready to want to fall in love with Victoria Amplifier, and I put it all on Bob Margolin. He was so instrumental in this kickoff, and it's something I couldn't have purchased if I'd have bought an ad in that magazine. It wouldn't have had anywhere near the impact of this personal story that Bob related. So I guess we really got our foot in the door by being tight with the world-class blues musicians I had access to here in Chicago. And then, of course, Clarksdale. I just got a groove from there.
Yeah. I mean, you make a damn good product, so I think it's well-earned. So
well, thank you.
Awesome.
It's all about the tone. It's all about building something with love and knowing that people are going to venerate it for years and years to come.
Yeah, all about tone. Cool. So to wrap up, is there anything else that you want our audience to know about your business? Where can people find you? What are your websites? Are you active on social media?
Okay, I wish I was more active on that stuff.
Yeah.
I'm kind of an analog guy.
Yeah. So
my ability to manipulate web stuff is pretty limited. We have a website, victoriaamplifier.com. I think it answers to both of those. I have a presence on Facebook, but I don't really know how to use the business side of Facebook. I have a personal Facebook page, and we got the Victoria Amplifier Facebook page.
Cool.
But that would be just victoriaamp.com, or you could call us here at the shop, 630-820-6400. I still pick up the phone, so if you want to talk about tone or soldering or, old Gibson amps.
Or Silvertones.
I'm here to Silvertones too, yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Are you active on Instagram at all or not?
Yes, yes. I like Instagram, and from time to time, I go through spurts with Instagram. Yeah. I'll post like a videos of me testing an amp. Yeah. And one of the things I think I should do more of, and I don't because it's just me and the girls. I had a dream of every amp I build.
Yeah.
I was gonna make a little video and put it on Instagram.
That's awesome. That's a cool idea.
I haven't done it. I've done it for about a fifth of them.
Okay.
Or maybe less than that. But
cool.
we have I think it's a Victoria Amplifier on Instagram, and there's a lot of posts and little videos on there. So.
And you sell directly to consumers. So if somebody wants to buy an amp today, is there a wait period, or do they have to? Can they buy it straight off the shelf?
We will sell directly to consumers in special circumstances, like when Bob Dylan's people call.
Yeah. Or Jacobs.
Right. I do prefer that consumers patronize our dealers because it's our dealers that keep me in business.
Cool.
Chicago Music Exchange, Humbucker Music. We got the Amp Tramp down in Nashville. True Tone Music in L.A., Rudy's in New York, and I'm leaving a ton of them out. Dave's Guitar and Lacrosse. They're all excellent dealers, and they all keep pretty good stock. But yeah, you're certainly free to call and talk, and if you have a special need or the dealer's too far, if you live in the middle of Montana where I don't have anybody reasonably close, then we could talk.
That's cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with me today and sharing your story. It's been an honor to have you on Small Business War Stories.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for that salutation. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for listening to Small Business War Stories. If you enjoy the show, share it with a friend, or you can subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or on our blog at blog.proven.com. If you have an idea for us, we'd love to hear it. Please email us at podcast@proven.com. See you next time. Small Business War Stories. Small businesses are the soul of America. And this is where they tell their stories. I am your host, Pablo Fuentes.